Hey everyone, Lazer here. Now, with the Isles of Madness release, there's been lots of new decks coming out, lots of really great players trying out new cards, seeing where they fit in old decks, coming up with some new ideas, and it's been really, really exciting. But with all the deck lists that are being floated around between players and different sites, between Reddit and Legends decks, there's a lot to look through and a lot to parse. So what I want to do today is take a look at some of the best ways that you can look through a deck list and see whether or not it's something you're interested in. See whether or not it's something you think will be powerful, see whether or not you think it'll be fun to play, and generally just how to get an idea of how a deck plays at a glance. So first of all, I think it's important to think about why this is an important skill. So first of all, when you're playing on ladder, one of the first things you have to do in every game is figure out what it is that your opponent is playing. Usually that'll be pretty self-evident through the first couple cards. Crown Quartermaster on turn 1, either an aggressive or mid-range strategy, most likely given their selected colors. But sometimes you come across something that you don't really know what you're seeing. A Crusader who's playing Bog Lurcher, if you've seen it before, probably Unstoppable Rage. If you haven't seen it before, then you're going to have to try and go through your pool of knowledge and see what you can come up with that may be something they're playing. The other thing that's important, in my opinion, is that if you can look over a deck list quickly and understand what the deck is trying to achieve, you will more quickly be able to play the deck well. It flattens that learning curve out a little bit over time because you've done a lot of the understanding and learning work up front when you looked at the deck list to start with. You don't need to have the list open next to you and say, oh, am I running that card? Or, oh, should I be saving this because it synergizes somewhere down the line? You can say, I've gotten an idea of the deck, so I can probably play this Barrow Stalker on turn 2. I don't need to save it for any sort of going aggressive to heal later against this other matchup. So when you can identify a deck's strengths and weaknesses and play patterns at a glance, do it quickly, it makes it easier to play the deck along the line when you're on the ladder, when you're trying to rank up. And a third reason that's kind of near and dear to my heart is that as a caster, I have to look at decks really, really quickly and understand what's going on. I have about maybe a minute, maybe 90 seconds to get a quick glance over what's going on and say, okay, I think I know what's going on here. And I can talk about it to the viewers and kind of give that information to someone else who maybe doesn't have the time to look at it beforehand when they're just watching a stream. So if you have any interest in casting or any interest in being in the production of tournaments, in the production of streaming, then this is a skill that you might want to work on. It's one that comes up relatively frequently in those areas. If it's something you're interested in, being able to do this quickly, look over a list and understand what it's trying to accomplish is something that is really, really valuable. So if we're going to go over how to look at a deck list, we're going to need one to look at. So we're going to be looking at this list that I shamelessly stole from Arkham Warlock. Great streamer, really friendly person. Definitely check out his stream at twitch.tv/Arkham Warlock if you have a chance. Arkham Warlock has been putting a little bit of work into this ramp rage warrior that's been popular ever since this sort of the Inferno came out in the mini expansion. Now, it's one that's been around for a relatively short amount of time, the deck as an idea. So it's had a lot of cards taken in and pulled out, and a lot of churn has gone into this deck since it's been conceptualized. I know Ian Bits has another version that I think is a lot of fun that has a Flesh Atronach as a one-of-win condition. But the reason I wanted to look at this one is because Arkham has put a lot of work into this, specifically on how to integrate the Isles of Madness cards. You'll notice that there's two of these Squish the Wimpy and a copy of Drive Mad. So I just wanted to look over this deck because it's a fun one. I think it's an interesting deck and it'll fit well into what we're going to talk about on how to look at lists. So tip number 1 is look at the curve of the deck. A curve can tell you a lot about what kind of deck you're looking at and what the deck is going to want to do. For anyone unaware, the curve of a deck refers to this right here, which is how many cards of what cost the deck includes. Aggressive decks will almost always have Curves that are centered around here in the 0 through 4, maybe 5 cost range for finishers. That means they're going to want to get a lot of cards out quickly and hit face really, really soon and try to close the game out very fast. And you can't really do that if you have a whole bunch of cards up at the top end that are costing 5, 6, 7 magicka. On the other hand, decks that want to go late, your control decks, your combo decks, may have more cards up here. In fact, they almost always will, because this is where their powerful cards lie. This is where their threats are going to sit, and the cards that they close the game out with are usually going to be higher magicka if you're looking at a control deck. Let's take a look at Warlock's list here. You can see there's a spike around 2, 3, and 4, and then another spike at 6 and 7 plus. So this is going to say that there's a good early game focus, but the late game is probably where the powerful stuff is going to land. This is a curve you'll see pretty often in decks that have a heavy focus on surviving early and then winning late. If you're looking at a deck that wants to win early, this may look relatively similar, but you won't see any of this top end. So the inclusion of the top end here is indicating that it probably wants to take the game later, and that can guide how you play this deck if you've never seen it before. If you're looking, you see, okay, between 1 and 4 is a whole lot of cards. It takes up about half of the screen. That means you're probably going to want to have a good amount of these cards in your hand early, and you're probably going to want to mulligan for them so that you can get to your later game stuff as the game gets longer. Technique number 2, identify what archetype the deck fits into. Now, archetypes mean a lot of different things depending on who you talk to. In this case, we're talking about the highest level possible. Are you an aggressive deck? Are you a controlling deck? Are you a combo deck? Are you a mid-range deck? Those large, broad categories are really important to identify quickly. That's going to relate to point 1, curve, very, very intimately, because as we were talking about, lower curve probably means you're going to be in an aggressive archetype. Now, archetype can also mean type of deck given the colors and the card selections. So, looking at this deck right here, we're going to see that we're probably a control deck. We have a heavy curve, and we have, based on the knowledge of the cards that we have, a couple of controlling tools. Arch and Venom Tongue, usually something that means you want to get toward the late game. Merchant's Camel, usually a draw card for control decks. Not always the case, but we can use these clues to tell ourselves that it's probably a control deck. And then we're made certain by that with these late game cards like the Pureblood Elder and the Night Talon Lord. Now, if we're talking about what archetype of a control deck that this deck fits into, we're an Unstoppable Rage deck. Now, it helps that I've looked at these sorts of decks many times. Maybe you don't know that Unstoppable Rage is an archetype unto itself. That's fine. What's important is recognizing those broad strokes. Are you an aggro deck, a control deck, or somewhere in between? You don't necessarily need to know at this point that Unstoppable Rage defines your deck. You don't need to have your deck defined by anything at all other than early game, late game, mid-range, somewhere in the middle. Knowing these sorts of broad strokes make it a lot easier to guide your play from the very beginning. Now, as you become more and more experienced, this is something you can decide really quickly. I can look at this curve, say, okay, late game, what is it? Go to the end game cards and say, okay, Unstoppable Rage, I recognize that that is a card that has defined many decks in the past, therefore I have a general idea of how this deck will play. That's something that is built up over time with more experience and is something that you can definitely build as a skill as you see more and more cards. Number 3, break the deck down into the different card types. If you don't know what that means, it's this box right here. Creatures, actions, items, supports, and prophecies is a keyword, but for the sake of looking at a deck, you can basically think of it as its own distinct card type. Knowing this is incredibly important. Different decks will have very different makeups of different card types, and that can greatly inform how they're going to play. A deck that is action heavy is going to have a harder time fighting for the board unless certain key cards are in hand. Think about classic Control Mage. This was a deck that wanted to control the board and make sure the opponent couldn't execute their game plan through the use of high impact removal actions. If you're looking at that deck, you're going to see that action count is really high and say, okay, I'm going to want to be drawing cards so I can always have the right answers in the form of actions in my hand. This deck is very different. It has a lot of creatures, so it's going to want to get on the board and have cards that can react already in place when the opponent plays something. Or it's going to need to put something down onto the board and then wait to use it later after the turn is passed and it has the ability to attack. Item decks are a little more rare and tend to be very combo focused if you're playing Sorcerer, or tend to be very tempo focused if you're playing things like Battle Mage. I'm not going to go too specific into item decks, but know that if you're playing an item deck and see a very high item count, then you're going to need to have creatures on board active as threats, meaning able to attack, if the items are going to have any real value. Support decks need to have the supports on the field in order to activate them, but they also get value over time guaranteed, assuming they're not removed. Things like creatures, if you put them on the board, can be removed by a large pool of cards. Supports, on the other hand, have a very narrow pool of cards that can interact with them. That's going to mean that these decks want to grind out value or have them in for a very specific purpose. Think of Support Mage from the Heroes of Skyrim era that wanted to go very extremely late game and grind out wins through repeated incremental value that was etched out by supports. Supports can often completely define a deck, and if you can identify what those supports are and how they're going to work with the rest of the cards, you'll be well on your way to understanding how to work that deck. Lastly is prophecies. Now, some decks are completely based around having a high prophecy count. Aggro Battle Mage with a high prophecy count is going to be very good at responding to other aggressive decks because they're putting threats down, and they're also putting threats down on their opponent's turn. This means they're able to put out more stuff than their opponent is and overwhelm them before they have a chance to win the game by their own game plan. Other decks that are more defensive with a lot of prophecies make it so that they have ways to respond on both turns. Their own turn, maybe through things like action-based removal, and on their opponent's turn with prophecy cards that stop them from executing their game plan on their own turn. Number 4 is relate this to other similar decks that you've seen in the past. If you can say that a couple cards between this deck that you're looking at and another deck that you're already familiar with are the same, then maybe that can inform how this deck is going to play. Oftentimes, you'll find that similar cards have similar uses between any two decks. Sometimes they can be dramatically different, but that's usually not going to be the case. So if you can say, okay, this deck functioned this way in a deck that I play all the time, maybe it'll function that way in this deck too. That said, maybe there's a lot of important differences between those decks as well. Let's take a look at this one where we know that we're an Unstoppable Rage deck. Now, another very popular Unstoppable Rage deck is Archer. Rage Archer is a deck that has been used for a long time and is very successful for a lot of people, depending on the meta. Now, the fact that we are a Rage deck as well means that we're going to have some similar plays. We're going to say, if their board is very full and we want to clear a lane, Unstoppable Rage provides that. And we know that in Rage Archer, part of the reason we ran Rage was because a lot of the creatures that we were going to use it on synergized very well with it. Think of Child of Hercene that gets to attack several times because it got a bunch of slay triggers. Think of Belligerent Giant that has breakthrough and a high power, meaning you can do a lot of damage to your opponent with that damage. A lot of those things are going to be similar here. We have Pureblood Elder at the top end can get breakthrough for a ton of damage as a finisher. That's something that's similar between the two decks. We even have a couple similar cards for rage targets like Belligerent Giant and Vigilant Giant. Both these archetypes, Rage Warrior and Rage Archer, have these cards in common, so we know that those plays are still going to work in this deck. Now, we also know that there's some big similarities. We're not running green, so that means we don't have the luxury of having the lethal creatures that Archer has in order to keep early game control. Well, earlier we saw that the deck has a pretty good clustering of cards at low magicka, so there's probably some different answers. When we take a look, we see that we're running ramp cards. We have Treeminder and Arch-Envenom Tongue for ways to get more Magicka faster, get to those big cards like Unstoppable Rage. Additionally, we have some other types of removal. So we don't have Archer's Gambit, but we do have 2 copies of Squish the Wimpy, which is the best card name ever, by the way, 3 copies of Sword of the Inferno, and then the singular Drive Mad, in addition to good old-fashioned creature combat. So while we don't have the same tools, we have at least partially a similar game plan of use the cards that we have early to control the board, survive until we can drop big late game threats, maybe close out the game with an Unstoppable Rage. So by looking at a deck that we already know, and by comparing similar cards and game plans, we now have somewhat of an idea of how Arkham's deck is going to work. We're going to ramp, we're going to stay alive early, with this time a couple of lethal creatures, but mostly by ramping. And then we're going to drop some big bombs, including Unstoppable Rage, similar to how we would in a Rage Archer deck. Number 5, identify win conditions and how you plan to get there. It's important to know how the game's going to win. Now, this relates back to the curve and the archetypes. Aggressive decks we already know are going to want to win early through direct damage. Control decks we know are going to want to win late after controlling the board, keeping the pace of the game where they're comfortable and disrupting the enemy's plan. But how that actually happens is going to differ a lot from deck to deck. Something like this Rage Warrior is going to want to go late the same way, say, a Tribunal control deck will want to, but the way they win once they've gotten there, and the way they get there in the first place, is going to be really, really different. So, looking at this deck, we have established that we are going to be a board-centric early game, where we want to get our creatures on the board and use them to respond to our opponent's threats. Great. Now, if we were a Tribunal control, then we wouldn't be playing many things on the board at all. Maybe some things to draw, maybe a little bit of ramp, but primarily, our early game is going to be based around removal actions. Things like Execute, Piercing Javelin, Lightning Bolt. That's going to mean that we have a very different set of supporting cards. Now, by supporting cards, I mean cards that don't directly win the game for us, but let us get to the point where we can use our game-winning cards at all. If we didn't have Arch-Envenom Tongue and Sword of the Inferno, for instance, then we'd never get a whole bunch of Magicka for Pureblood Elder to come online and do a whole bunch of damage. That said, that's going to be different for other types of decks. A deck like, say, Aggressive Halalu may use Divine Fervor. Divine Fervor is not a card that wins the game. You can't put it down and say, all right, cool, we're done here. It's a card that enables other cards such as Charge Creatures, Token Generators. Fifth Legion Trainer is very, very similar, where it's a card that bolsters your strategy and moves you toward your goal of winning the game by direct damage, but doesn't offer a lot of direct damage itself. Then you have cards that actually do win you the game. This is going to be your Unstoppable Rages, your Night Talon Lords, your Pureblood Elders, things that you can slam down and say, all right, I'm going to win the game in the next couple turns. This is how I do it. It's important to recognize which of those cards are going to be useful in which scenarios. If you have a mulligan and you get a whole bunch of endgame cards that you're going to win the game with, that's great, but you need to get there first. So in this deck, if I see an opening hand of Cicero, Merchant's Camel, and Vigilant Giant. Cicero and Merchant's Camel are supporting cards in the mid-game. They're cards that, after I've already done a little bit of stabilization, I want to start being able to draw cards and get toward my late game. Vigilant Giant is my late game. It doesn't help me get to my late game at all. So I probably want to pitch all 3 of those cards and hope to find things like the Barrow Stalker, like the Skaven Pyromancer, maybe even Drive Mad, even though that's a bit expensive for a keep on a mulligan. If you can identify the cards that get you to your goal and the cards that actually are your goal, then that is a really, really key step in identifying how your game is going to be played with these decks. Number 6, think about its matchups. This game is a multiplayer game. You are not playing solitaire, so that means you're going to have to consider how the deck that you're looking at is going to fare against other people's decks. Now, there are generally a couple of rules of thumb about how aggro is better than some decks, about how control is better than some decks, and those are very, very useful. There's a lot written about that kind of just out on the internet, specifically about how it relates to Magic the Gathering. If you're interested, I highly suggest checking those out. They can be really helpful. And how about in Legends specifically? Well, the meta changes all the time based on new releases, tournament finishes, if someone finds something really spicy that everyone thinks is awesome, whatever Justin Larson put out recently. But knowing what those decks are can be really important when you're looking at a new deck list. Knowing how you match up to the playing field can be really, really important. So let's say that we know that these decks, Unstoppable Rage decks, tend to do well when Unstoppable Rage can hit a bunch of targets. So that means aggro decks that go wide, or as a comeback tool against tall threats such as a mid-range warrior. If we know that those decks are very, very popular, then maybe this will do well. If we know that those decks don't have a lot of game right now, then maybe we can hold off on this deck until the environment's a little more hospitable. So looking at this one, we know that we have a whole bunch of healing between Barrow Stalker, sort of the Inferno, offering a little bit more use out of those cards, Night Shadow Rages, and then we have a bunch of guards between, again, Barrow Stalker, Tree Minders, and Arch-and-Venom Tongue is a pseudo guard because they're going to want to trade into it before you can get the Magicka ramp oftentimes. That means that maybe we're pretty good against aggressive decks because we have pretty good comeback mechanics with the Rages and good ways to slow them down in the early game. But maybe that means we're bad against yellow decks because they're running Cast into Time these days everywhere. Then maybe that means this isn't the time for this deck to come out. I'm not going to say anything about this deck in the current meta because Isles of Madness is so new that we don't really know what's going to be popular right now. But if you're looking at a deck a couple months down the road, then that's going to be a really, really important consideration to make when you're looking over a new deck list. Number 7, almost there. What does this deck do better or worse compared to other decks that are trying to do similar plans? Again, let's take Control Tribunal. That is a deck that wants to go to the late game, and it wants to play big threats the same way we do at 10 plus Magicka, after we've already stabilized and put ourselves in the driver's seat. Well, okay, we have similar plans. Great. How do we do it differently? Do we do it better than them in some cases? Do we do it worse than them in some cases? So let's say that a very popular deck is one that goes tall, which means it plays one very large threat every turn. Think of Mid-Battle Mage playing a Blood Dragon on turn 5. Now, we have some answers to that. We have the Arch-and-Venom Tongue being able to use its lethal abilities alongside items like the Crossbow or the Sword of the Inferno as ways to deal with large threats. But we're relatively limited in our ability to do that from hand. If the Arch-and-Venom Tongue sticks around for a turn, then sure, we can get some repeated value out of that. Tribunal Control, on the other hand, runs a lot of single targeted removal. So maybe Control Tribunal is going to be better suited for dealing with decks that run singular large threats. By comparison, we're running Unstoppable Rage with creatures that are very, very good combined with that card. That means we have a very good comeback mechanic and a very good win condition against wide boards. Tribunal Control doesn't have very good ways usually to turn their wide board into a victory. So we can flip the script much, much better than a Control Tribunal deck will do. Maybe we have more healing than them, depending on how they're building their version of Tribunal Control. Maybe they have more healing depending on how we're building our version of Rage Warrior. These are the things that are worth considering when you're saying, okay, I want to play a control deck. I'm going to go look at 5 deck lists and pick one out of that list. It's important to say, okay, this does that a little bit better, but I really value these characteristics of another deck. So by taking stock of what you want a deck to look like, and by comparing those qualities between different deck lists, it can help a lot in determining whether or not you want to take this list onto the ladder or not. Number 8, last step, last tip, last technique. By now, we've got an idea of what the deck wants to do, how it aims to do that, and how it does it uniquely compared to other decks with roughly similar goals. Now, here comes the most important part. Why do I specifically want to play this deck instead of that other one? Sure, maybe it's a little more effective at this, maybe it gets a couple percentage points more wins because of this reason, but why am I excited about this deck? What's interesting? What's calling to me about this one? Maybe its game plan is one I've never tried before. If I'm a control one trick, always want to go late game, always trying to make the game happen on my terms and disrupt your plan, maybe I want to do something different and play an aggressive list. Great reason. There are aggressive cards in a list and I want to play them. Great. Maybe in this list, I've never played a rage list. That's another very, very reasonable reason to take a list onto the ladder, is saying this card in specific looks awesome to me. Unstoppable Rage? Yeah, great card. Let's do it. That sounds really cool. Maybe there's something a little trickier, a little more subtle about the deck that's calling to you. For instance, this version of the Rage Warrior list is running a lot of recursion, meaning it likes to bring things out of the graveyard and get repeated value out of that between Odinir Necromancer and Falkreath Defiler. Using the graveyard as a resource is something that's relatively unique to these types of Rage Warrior builds, and maybe that's a reason you want to play it. Point is, look for a reason to want to play this deck. If it's going to be fun for you, if you want to win and this looks powerful, if it's doing something you've never done before, we're playing a game that we want to enjoy. And you need to look at the deck list and say, am I going to enjoy this? Why is that? And does it have what I'm looking for? And there it is, my top tips for how to read a deck list that you've never seen before. Now, we did this through the lens of a control deck, but it's important to remember that these tips can apply to any kind of list that you may see, from the fastest to the slowest, from the simplest to the most complex, unless you're looking at a Warrior 7 deck, in which case just ask him because his shit gets ridiculous. So, let me know what you think. Leave a comment about how you approach deck lists. Give me a like, give me a subscription, and you'll be able to see all of my content. I release a new video about once a week. I also stream on Twitch occasionally. All of this information will be found in the description. And until next time, I'll see you guys around.